Elena Vargas stood frozen in the doorway of Lorenzo Bianchi's private office, watching the most dangerous man in New York City stare at her phone screen with an expression that made her blood turn to ice. His fingers gripped the device so tightly she thought it might shatter, and when his dark eyes lifted to meet hers, she saw something she'd never witnessed in 5 years of working for him. Pure, unfiltered rage mixed with something that looked almost like betrayal. The photo on the screen showed a 4-year-old boy with unmistakable features: olive skin, dark curls, and eyes the exact shade of stormy gray that currently burned into her soul. Lorenzo's voice came out low and deadly. "When were you planning to tell me I had a son?" In that moment, Elena knew her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. And the Mafia boss who controlled half the city's underworld was about to claim what he believed was his, whether she wanted him to or not. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Elena's meticulously organized life. She'd woken at 5:30, pressed snooze exactly once as she always did, then dragged herself from the warmth of her modest Brooklyn apartment bed to check on her son. Mateo had been sprawled across his small mattress like a starfish, his dark curls wild against the pillowcase decorated with cartoon dinosaurs. She'd stood there for 3 precious minutes, just watching him breathe, storing up the memory of his peaceful face before the chaos of her day began. This was her ritual, her reminder of why she did everything she did, why she worked for a man whose business dealings occasionally gave her nightmares, why she kept secrets that could get her killed. By 6:15, she'd showered, dressed in one of her conservative work dresses, this one a deep navy that Lorenzo had once commented made her look professional, and started preparing breakfast. Mateo had wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, dragging his stuffed elephant behind him, and she'd felt that familiar ache in her chest. He looked so much like his father it sometimes hurt to breathe. The same strong jawline starting to emerge from baby fat. The same intense way of looking at things as if he could see straight through to their core. The same habit of tilting his head slightly when he was thinking. "Mama, can we go to the park after school?" he'd asked, climbing into his chair with the determination of someone scaling a mountain. Elena had crouched down to his level, brushing those unruly curls back from his forehead. "Not today, sweetie. Mama has to work late, but Mrs. Chen will pick you up and she said you can help her bake cookies." The disappointment in his eyes had gutted her, but she'd learned to live with that particular brand of guilt. Single mothers working for demanding bosses didn't get the luxury of park visits on weekdays. She'd kissed his forehead, packed his lunch with an extra juice box as an apology he was too young to understand, and walked him to the bus stop 3 blocks away. Maria Chen, her elderly neighbor who watched Mateo most afternoons, had been waiting there with her own grandson, and Elena had felt that familiar gratitude mixed with inadequacy that came from relying on the kindness of others to raise her child. The subway ride into Manhattan had been packed as usual, bodies pressed together in that uncomfortable intimacy that New Yorkers had perfected the art of ignoring. Elena had stood with one hand on the pole, the other clutching her bag, and mentally reviewed her schedule. Lorenzo had meetings all morning with people whose names she knew better than to remember. Lunch with his consigliere Dante at the usual restaurant where the owner kept a private room always available. And then the afternoon would be dedicated to reviewing the financial reports from their legitimate businesses, the ones that existed to make the illegitimate ones look respectable. She'd worked for Lorenzo Bianchi for 5 years, ever since she'd been desperate enough to take a job that paid 3 times what a normal executive assistant made and required her to occasionally pretend she didn't notice when men with suspicious bulges under their jackets came and went from the office. The pay was incredible, the hours were brutal, and her boss was the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about. Powerful, ruthless, devastatingly handsome in that dangerous way that made smart women stupid, and completely off-limits for about a dozen reasons, not least of which was the fact that he could have her killed with a phone call if she ever crossed him. What Lorenzo didn't know, what no one in his organization knew, was that Elena had crossed him long before she'd ever walked through his office doors. 5 years ago, she'd been a different person with a different name, working at a high-end charity gala where New York's elite mingled with its underground elite, where politicians shook hands with men who made their fortunes in ways that would never appear on tax returns. She'd been serving champagne, trying to make rent on her terrible studio apartment, putting herself through night classes in business administration, and telling herself that catering for rich people was just temporary. Lorenzo had been there that night, younger then but no less commanding, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than her annual salary, and exuding the kind of confidence that came from knowing you were untouchable. She should have stayed away from him. Every instinct she possessed had screamed danger when his eyes had found her across the room, but he'd smiled at her, really smiled. Not the polite grimace rich men gave to service workers, but something genuine and warm and interested, and her common sense had evaporated like champagne bubbles. They'd talked during her breaks, hidden away in a quiet corner of the venue's garden, where fairy lights had turned everything magical and unreal. He told her his name was Enzo, not Lorenzo, as if that made him someone different, someone safe. He'd asked about her studies, her dreams, what she wanted from life, and he'd listened like her answers actually mattered. When he'd kissed her under those fairy lights, she'd let herself believe in fairy tales. When he'd taken her back to his penthouse apartment, she'd let herself pretend that girls like her ended up with men like him in any reality other than the fantasies sold in romance novels. The next morning, she'd woken alone to a note with a phone number and a promise to call. She'd waited 3 days before accepting he was never going to. Rich men didn't call back the catering staff they slept with. That was just how the world worked. She'd cried, gotten over it, and moved on with her life. Then 6 weeks later, she'd been throwing up in a restaurant bathroom, and suddenly moving on wasn't an option anymore. Finding out she was pregnant had been terrifying enough. Finding out the father of her baby was Lorenzo Bianchi. The Lorenzo Bianchi whose name appeared in whispered conversations about organized crime, who made the news occasionally when some rival ended up dead or some business deal went through. That shouldn't have been possible. That had been the kind of terrifying that made her consider leaving the state entirely. She'd done research, obsessive hours of it, and learned that the charming Enzo who'd listened to her dreams was actually a man who controlled drug distribution, illegal gambling, and protection rackets across 5 boroughs. A man who'd inherited his empire from his father and expanded it with ruthless efficiency. A man who definitely did not need a pregnant former catering worker showing up claiming he'd fathered her child. So she hadn't told him. She'd made the choice that had seemed smartest at the time, to keep her baby and keep her secret. She'd worked throughout her pregnancy, saved every penny, delivered Matteo in a city hospital with only Maria Chen holding her hand, and built a life that had nothing to do with Lorenzo Bianchi. Then 4 years later, desperate for a job that paid enough to cover childcare and rent in a city that devoured money, she'd seen the listing for an executive assistant position with benefits that seemed too good to be true. The company had been listed as Bianchi Enterprises, but she'd told herself it was a common Italian name, that it couldn't possibly be him. Even when the address had been in the same building where she'd once woken up alone, she'd convinced herself it was coincidence. New York was full of expensive buildings, rich people clustered together. Walking into that interview and seeing Lorenzo sitting behind an enormous desk, 5 years older and somehow even more intimidating in a business suit than he'd been in a tuxedo, had nearly stopped her heart. But he hadn't recognized her. Why would he? She'd been one girl among probably hundreds. A brief entertainment during a boring charity function. She'd changed too, cut her hair shorter, started wearing glasses she didn't really need, carried herself differently now that she was a mother with responsibilities, instead of a dreamy student with unrealistic hopes. She'd gotten the job based on her qualifications and her ability to keep her hands from shaking during the interview. And for 5 years, she'd worked for the father of her child, while he remained completely oblivious to the fact that the woman who organized his calendar and brought him coffee shared DNA with the little boy who was the center of her entire universe. It had been a delicate balance, requiring constant vigilance. She never mentioned having a child, wore long sleeves to cover the small scar on her wrist from where Matteo had accidentally scratched her as a baby, kept her personal life so private that most of the office assumed she was either incredibly boring or hiding something scandalous, probably an affair with a married man. She worked harder than anyone else, stayed later, came in earlier, made herself indispensable so Lorenzo would overlook her occasional need to leave exactly at 5:30 to make it to daycare pickup. Lorenzo himself had been easier to work for than she'd expected, and infinitely harder in ways she couldn't have predicted. He was demanding but fair, brutal in business, but oddly considerate with her, remembering how she took her coffee and that she had a shellfish allergy, even though they'd never eaten together. He had a temper that could level buildings, but he'd never directed it at her, not once in 5 years. And he was still devastatingly attractive in that dangerous way, still made her pulse race when he stood too close, still occasionally looked at her with an intensity that suggested maybe, just maybe, some part of him remembered that night 5 years ago, even if he couldn't place where he knew her from. She'd trained herself not to react to those looks, to maintain her professional distance, to remember that Lorenzo Bianchi was her boss and her son's father, and absolutely nothing else could ever happen between them. It had worked perfectly for 5 years. Right up until this morning, when her carefully constructed walls had come crashing down because of one stupid, careless mistake. The office of Bianchi Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan with views that stretched across the city like a map of conquered territory. Elena had arrived at 7:30 as usual, stopped at the coffee shop on the corner that knew Lorenzo's order by heart, and settled into her desk in the outer office that served as a buffer between Lorenzo and the rest of the world. She'd been reviewing his schedule, mentally preparing for the chaos ahead, when her phone had buzzed with a text from Maria. The message had included a photo, Matteo at the kitchen table with flour on his nose and the biggest smile on his face, clearly already starting on those promised cookies. Even though it was barely 8 in the morning, Elena had smiled at the screen, feeling that familiar bittersweet ache of missing moments in her son's life, because she was here making sure Lorenzo Bianchi's day ran smoothly. She'd been so absorbed in the image that she hadn't heard Lorenzo's private elevator arrive, hadn't noticed him walking through the outer office, hadn't realized he was standing right behind her until his voice, curious and entirely too close, had asked, "Who's the kid?" Elena had jumped like she'd been electrocuted, fumbling with her phone, but it was too late. Lorenzo's reflexes were faster than hers, honed by years of living in a world where hesitation got you killed. He'd plucked the phone from her hands before she could even think to pull it away, and she'd watched in horror as his expression had shifted from mild curiosity to absolute stillness. The silence that followed had lasted maybe 10 seconds, but felt like hours. She'd watched his face, seen the moment recognition had dawned, not of her, but of the child in the photo. Matteo looked exactly like the photos of young Lorenzo that occasionally appeared in articles about his family's history. The same features that were distinctly Bianchi, the same coloring, the same everything. "How old?" Lorenzo had asked, his voice deadly quiet. Elena's mouth had gone dry. "I don't know what you're asking. Don't." The single word had cracked like a whip. "Don't lie to me. How old is he?" 4, she'd whispered, because lying at that point would have been suicide. Lorenzo's jaw had clenched so hard she'd heard his teeth grind. 4 years old. Lorenzo, I can explain. Can you? He'd turned to look at her finally, and the fury in his eyes had been terrifying. Can you explain why my son is 4 years old, and I'm just finding out about him now? Can you explain why you've worked for me for 5 years, seen me every single day, and never once mentioned that I have a child? He's my son, Elena had said, finding some core of courage she hadn't known she possessed. I raised him. You don't just get to claim him because you saw a photo. The laugh that had escaped Lorenzo had been bitter and entirely humorless. I don't get to claim my own child? That's rich, Elena. That's really rich. He'd held up her phone, staring at the photo again. He looks exactly like me. Exactly. Like I'm looking at pictures of myself as a kid. And you're telling me I don't have a right to know he exists? You didn't want to know, she'd said, the words coming out sharper than intended. 5 years ago, you didn't call. You didn't want anything to do with me. Why would I think you'd want anything to do with a baby? Lorenzo had gone very still. 5 years ago, we've met before. And that's when Elena had realized her second mistake of the morning. In her panic, she'd revealed too much. It doesn't matter. It matters, Lorenzo had said softly, and somehow that was more frightening than when he'd been angry. Tell me where we met. Elena had considered continuing to lie, but what was the point? Her whole world was already imploding. The Hastings Charity Gala. You told me your name was Enzo. We talked in the garden. You took me back to your penthouse, and the next morning you were gone. She'd watched the memory surface in his eyes, seen the moment he placed her. The girl with the champagne tray. You had longer hair. And you had better manners, Elena had shot back, fear making her reckless. You left a phone number you never answered. I was in the hospital, Lorenzo had said, his voice tight. There was an attempt on my life that morning. I spent 3 weeks unconscious and another 2 in recovery. By the time I could have called, I figured you'd moved on, and I was too much of a coward to find out for sure. The confession had stolen Elena's righteous anger, left her floundering. I didn't know. No, you didn't. Just like I didn't know you were pregnant. Just like I didn't know I had a son. Lorenzo had set her phone down on the desk with careful precision, the kind of control that suggested he was holding back something explosive. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me your address. I'm going to meet my son, and then we're going to figure out how this is going to work going forward. You can't just barge into his life, Elena had protested. He doesn't know anything about you. He thinks his father is someone who couldn't be part of his life. I can't just bring you home and say surprise. Here's your dad who happens to be a mafia boss. The muscle in Lorenzo's jaw had ticked. I don't recall asking your permission. That's my son, mine, and you've kept him from me for 4 years. So yes, Elena, I absolutely can barge into his life, because you don't get to make these decisions alone anymore. I was protecting him, Elena had said desperately. Your world is dangerous, Lorenzo. You know it is. I didn't want him anywhere near that. My world, Lorenzo had repeated slowly. The world you've been part of for 5 years? The world you've accepted paychecks from? That world, the hypocrisy of her position had hit her like cold water. That's different. Is it? You've been fine taking my money, fine working for me, fine being associated with me professionally. But the moment it comes to my son, suddenly I'm too dangerous? Too tainted? Lorenzo had moved closer, invading her space in a way he never had before. That child is a Bianchi whether you like it or not. He carries my blood, my DNA, probably my temperament if he's anything like me. You don't get to pretend that away. I'm not pretending anything away, Elena had said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I'm trying to give him a normal childhood. Normal, Lorenzo had scoffed. You think it's normal to grow up without a father? You think it's normal to never know half of who you are? I grew up in this world, Elena. I know exactly how brutal it can be. But I also know that being a Bianchi comes with protection, with resources, with a family that would kill and die for him. You've denied him all of that because you decided I wasn't worth telling. Tears had burned in Elena's eyes, but she'd refused to let them fall. I was scared. Something in Lorenzo's expression had softened, just slightly. Of me? Of everything, of you rejecting him, of you taking him away, of him getting hurt because of who you are. I was 23 and pregnant and terrified, Lorenzo. I made the choice that seemed safest at the time. And now, Lorenzo had asked quietly. Now I don't know, Elena had admitted. Now everything is falling apart, and I don't know how to protect him. Lorenzo had reached out then, his hand cupping her chin and tilting her face up to meet his eyes. The gesture had been oddly gentle from a man capable of such violence. You protect him by letting me help, by letting me be his father, by trusting that I would die before I let anything happen to my son. The intensity in his voice had made her believe him, which was probably dangerous. This isn't how I wanted this to happen. I know, Lorenzo had said, and for a moment she'd seen past the mafia boss to the man underneath, the one who had listened to her dreams in a garden 5 years ago. But it's happening anyway. So give me your address, Elena. Let me meet my son. She'd written it down with shaking hands, watching as Lorenzo had folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket like it was something precious. He gets home from pre-K at 3:30. Maria, our neighbor, usually watches him until I get home around 6. I'll be there at 4, Lorenzo had said. That gives you time to prepare him however you need to. Lorenzo, Elena had started, but he'd cut her off. This isn't negotiable. I've missed 4 years of his life. I'm not missing another day. He'd headed toward his office, then paused at the doorway. And Elena, You're taking the rest of the day off. Go home. Talk to your son. Figure out how you're going to explain this. Because one way or another, I'm walking through that door at 4 o'clock. The door had closed behind him with a soft click that had sounded like a prison sentence. Elena had called Maria from the subway, trying to explain without really explaining that Mateo's father had suddenly appeared in their lives and would be coming by later. Maria, bless her, had asked no questions beyond. Are you safe? When Elena had assured her she was, Maria had simply said to call if she needed anything and that she'd keep Mateo until Elena came to get him. The apartment had felt too small and too empty when Elena had walked in at 9 in the morning, hours before she should have been home. She'd sat on her worn couch, the one with the spring that poked through on the left side, and tried to figure out how to tell a 4-year-old that the father who'd never been part of his life was suddenly going to be very present indeed. Mateo had never asked many questions about his father. At 4, his world was simple and complete, with just the two of them and Maria and his pre-K friends. When he'd asked where his daddy was, Elena had told him that some families looked different than others, that they had each other, and that was what mattered. He'd seemed satisfied with that, probably because half the kids in his class came from single-parent homes or had complicated family situations. Normal was relative when you grew up in Brooklyn, but explaining Lorenzo Bianchi was going to require more than platitudes about different kinds of families. How did you tell a child that his father was one of the most powerful criminals in New York? How did you prepare a 4-year-old for the reality that his life was about to change in ways Elena couldn't even fully predict? She'd picked Mateo up from Maria's at 2, giving herself 90 minutes to figure out the impossible. He'd chattered the whole walk home about the cookies they'd made, about how his friend Lucas had pushed him on the swings at recess, about how his teacher had read them a story about dragons. Elena had listened and made appropriate responses, and felt her heart breaking with every step closer to their building. At home, she'd settled him on the couch with his stuffed elephant and taken a deep breath. Mateo, honey, I need to talk to you about something important. He'd looked up at her with those gray eyes that were too much like Lorenzo's, his expression going serious in that way children did when they sensed something big was coming. Am I in trouble? No, baby, not at all. It's about your daddy. Interest had sparked immediately. My daddy? The one who couldn't be with us? Elena had felt guilt twist in her stomach. Yes. The thing is, I made a mistake. Your daddy didn't know about you. He didn't know he had a son, and today he found out, and he wants to meet you. Mateo had processed this with the intensity of someone far older than 4. Why didn't he know? It's complicated, sweetheart. Grown-up things that went wrong. But he knows now, and he's really happy that you exist. Is he nice? Mateo had asked, which was such a reasonable question that Elena had almost laughed. Was Lorenzo nice? That was complicated too. He can be. He's very powerful and very busy, and his life is different from ours, but I think he's going to love you very much. Will he live with us? Elena had hesitated. She hadn't even thought that far ahead, too focused on getting through the immediate crisis. I don't know yet. We'll have to see how things go. Mateo had nodded solemnly, then asked, Can I show him my dinosaur collection? The innocence of the question had nearly broken her. I think he'd like that very much. At 3:55, Elena had been pacing the small living room while Mateo carefully arranged his plastic dinosaurs on the coffee table, preparing for his presentation. When the knock came at precisely 4 o'clock, she'd felt her heart jump into her throat. Lorenzo had filled the doorway of her modest apartment, looking wildly out of place in his expensive suit among her second-hand furniture and Mateo's scattered toys. His eyes had scanned the space, taking in every detail, and Elena had felt suddenly defensive about the chipped paint and the carpet that had seen better days, and the fact that her entire apartment could probably fit inside Lorenzo's master bathroom. But Lorenzo hadn't seemed to notice any of that. His attention had locked onto the small boy standing beside Elena, half hidden behind her legs, but peeking out with undisguised curiosity. For a long moment, neither of them had moved, and Elena had held her breath watching the most dangerous man she knew stare at his son for the first time. Then Lorenzo had done something she'd never expected. He lowered himself down until he was at Mateo's eye level, his expensive suit pants touching her questionable carpet. And when he'd spoken, his voice had been gentle. "Hello, Mateo. My name is Lorenzo. I'm your father." Mateo had studied him with that serious expression he wore when he was thinking hard. "You look like me." A smile had ghosted across Lorenzo's face, something genuine and unguarded that Elena had never seen in 5 years of working for him. "I was just thinking the same thing. You look exactly like I did when I was your age." "Mama says you didn't know about me," Mateo had said, with the blunt honesty of children who hadn't learned to soften truth yet. "I didn't," Lorenzo had confirmed, "but I do now, and I'm very glad." "Do you like dinosaurs?" Mateo had asked, which was apparently his measure of acceptable adult company. "I don't know much about them," Lorenzo had admitted, "but I'd like to learn." That had been the magic answer. Mateo had grabbed Lorenzo's hand, much larger and scarred in ways that told stories Elena didn't want to know, and dragged him toward the coffee table. "I have 17 dinosaurs. This one is a T-Rex, and he's the biggest, but the velociraptor is actually smarter." Elena had watched, stunned, as Lorenzo Bianchi, who controlled an empire built on violence and intimidation, sat on her worn carpet and listened with apparent fascination as a 4-year-old explained the difference between herbivores and carnivores. He'd ask questions, real ones that showed he was actually listening, and Mateo had bloomed under the attention like flowers toward sunlight. An hour had passed with Elena, standing awkwardly in her own living room, not sure what her role was in this strange tableau. Lorenzo and Mateo had moved from dinosaurs to building blocks, constructing what Mateo declared was a fortress for the dinosaurs to live in. Lorenzo's phone had buzzed repeatedly, but he'd ignored it every time, his focus entirely on the child who was chattering away as if he'd known his father his entire life. Finally, when Mateo had yawned for the 3rd time, Lorenzo had checked his watch and stood. "I should go. It's getting late and you probably need dinner." "Will you come back?" Mateo had asked, looking up at him with such hope that Elena's chest had ached. "If your mother says it's okay, I'd like to come back tomorrow," Lorenzo had said, his eyes meeting Elena's over Mateo's head. She'd wanted to say no, wanted to keep her carefully constructed walls intact, but the expression on her son's face had made that impossible. "Tomorrow is fine." Lorenzo had ruffled Mateo's hair, the gesture awkward but clearly genuine, then followed Elena to the door. Once they were in the hallway, out of Mateo's earshot, his entire demeanor had changed. The gentle father had disappeared, replaced by the man who ran a criminal empire. "We need to talk," Lorenzo had said, his voice low. "Really talk. About what this means and how this is going to work." "I know," Elena had said quietly. "Tomorrow, after I visit with Mateo, you and I are going to sit down and figure this out. Everything, Elena. Custody, living arrangements, his safety. All of it." "He's happy where he is," Elena had protested. "This apartment, his school, his routine. This apartment has a broken lock on the front door downstairs and no security system," Lorenzo had said flatly. "His school is fine, but it's not equipped to protect him if anyone figures out he's my son. And his routine is about to change dramatically whether you like it or not. Because I'm going to be part of his life now, and that comes with complications. I don't want him in danger because of you," Elena had said, the words sharp. "Neither do I. Which is exactly why we need to make changes." Lorenzo had stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. "You think I haven't already had my people checking out this building? The security is a joke, Elena. Anyone could get in. Anyone could get to him. And the moment word gets out that I have a son, every enemy I've ever made is going to see him as a target." The reality of what he was saying had settled over her like ice water. "I can't afford to move somewhere with better security." "You won't have to afford it," Lorenzo had said. "I will. That's what fathers do, Elena. They provide for their children. They protect them." "By moving us into your world," Elena had said bitterly. "By making him part of the violence. By keeping him alive," Lorenzo had countered. "Your principles are admirable, but they're not going to stop a bullet or a kidnapping attempt. I can." Elena had wanted to argue, but the fear already taking root in her chest had made that difficult. She'd spent 4 years successfully keeping Mateo away from Lorenzo's world, but now that world was coming for them whether she liked it or not. I need time to think. You don't have time, Lorenzo had said bluntly. The moment I walked through that door, the clock started. My people know where I went. They're discreet but word spreads. We have maybe a week before someone outside my organization figures out I have a son. I need you both somewhere secure before that happens. A week, Elena had repeated numbly, at most. Lorenzo had cupped her face, the gesture startling in its tenderness. I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you've built a life here and you're trying to protect him. But let me protect him too. Let me do what I should have been doing for the last 4 years. There had been something in his eyes, regret maybe, or determination, or some combination that made Elena's defenses crack just slightly. Where would we go? I have a property in Westchester, gated community, armed security, completely separate from my business operations. You and Matteo would have your own space. Complete privacy. He could still go to school, have friends, have a normal life. Just a safer version of normal. And what would you be? Elena had asked. A weekend father? Someone who visits when it's convenient? Lorenzo's jaw had tightened. I'll be whatever I need to be, whatever he needs me to be. But I'm not going to be an absent father, Elena. I'm not going to let him grow up wondering why his dad didn't want him. The pain in those words had suggested history Elena didn't know. Wounds from Lorenzo's own childhood that he clearly had no intention of repeating. He's happy here, she'd said, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. He's happy because he has you, and that's enough for now. But kids grow up, Elena. They start asking questions. They start noticing that other kids have fathers who show up to school events and teach them to ride bikes and keep them safe from the monsters in the closet. I want to be that father. I want to be part of his life in all the ways that matter. Lorenzo had dropped his hand from her face, stepping back. Think about it tonight, but Elena, understand this. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen. The only question is whether you're going to fight me every step of the way, or whether we're going to figure out how to do this together. The door had closed behind him, leaving Elena alone in the hallway with a future that looked nothing like the one she'd carefully planned. She'd gone back inside to find Matteo already in his pajamas, having somehow gotten himself ready for bed without her noticing. Mama, I like him, he'd said simply, climbing into her lap on the couch. Elena had held him tight, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo and trying not to think about how quickly everything was changing. I'm glad, baby. Is he going to be my daddy now? Like, all the time? I think so, Elena had said, because lying seemed impossible when he was looking at her with such trust. Good, Matteo had said with satisfaction. Lucas has a daddy, and now I have one too. The innocence of it had made Elena want to cry. Her son, who'd never complained about his father's absence, who'd seemed perfectly content with just the two of them, had apparently been quietly envying his friends who had fathers all along. She'd been so focused on protecting him that she'd never considered she might also be depriving him. That night, after Matteo had fallen asleep clutching his stuffed elephant, Elena had sat at her tiny kitchen table and tried to sort through the chaos her life had become. Lorenzo was right about the security concerns. This building was old and the locks were terrible, and she'd seen too much in 5 years of working for him to pretend his enemies wouldn't use a child as leverage. But moving to Westchester, living in a property Lorenzo owned, accepting his protection and his money, that meant giving up her independence. It meant tying herself and Matteo to him in ways that would be impossible to undo. It also meant Matteo would have a father, a real one, not just a vague concept or an explanation about families being different. Whatever else Lorenzo was, whatever his business involved, he'd been genuinely engaged with their son tonight. The way he'd listened, the way he'd gotten down on the floor to play, the way he'd looked at Matteo like he was something precious. Those weren't things you could fake. Elena had made her decision sometime around midnight, when fear and pragmatism had finally overridden her stubborn need to maintain control. She'd texted Lorenzo, knowing he was probably still awake because men who ran criminal empires didn't keep normal hours. We'll move, but I have conditions. His response had come within seconds. Name them. Matteo comes first in every decision. His safety, his happiness, his normal life. Those are non-negotiable. Agreed. I keep working. Not for you. I can't do that anymore. but I'm not going to be dependent on you financially beyond what's necessary for Matteo. There had been a longer pause before his response. That's going to be complicated, but we'll figure something out. And we set boundaries. You're his father, I'm his mother, we co-parent. But you don't get to use him as leverage against me or try to push me out of his life because you have more resources. Elena, I'm not trying to push you out. I'm trying to bring you both in. There's a difference. Just promise me. I promise. Matteo needs both of us. I understand that. Elena had stared at her phone screen, at those words that should have reassured her, but somehow made everything feel more real and more terrifying. When do we move? This weekend. I'll have everything arranged. You won't have to do anything except pack what you want to keep. That fast? That necessary. Trust me on this, Elena. Please? She'd sent back a simple okay, and then sat in the dark of her kitchen, wondering if she'd just made the best decision of her life or the worst. Probably both. Definitely both. The rest of the week had passed in a blur of activity that left Elena feeling like she was watching her life happen to someone else. Lorenzo had appeared at the apartment Thursday evening with a woman he'd introduced as Sophia, an interior designer who apparently worked exclusively for his properties. Sophia had walked through the small apartment with a tablet, photographing Matteo's room, asking questions about his favorite colors and interests, making notes about furniture and storage, and all the things Elena had never been able to afford. We're recreating his space, Lorenzo had explained when Elena had pulled him aside, so the transition is easier. His room in Westchester will look similar enough that he won't feel like he's in a completely foreign place. You're hiring an interior designer for a 4-year-old's bedroom, Elena had said, still trying to wrap her mind around this level of wealth and attention to detail. I'm making sure my son feels at home, Lorenzo had corrected. There's a difference. Matteo had been thrilled by all the attention, especially when Sophia had asked him to draw pictures of what his dream bedroom would look like. He'd created elaborate crayon masterpieces featuring dinosaurs, spaceships, and what appeared to be a castle made entirely of blocks. Sophia had photographed every drawing with the seriousness of someone documenting fine art. Lorenzo had been there every evening that week, arriving at 4 and staying until Matteo's bedtime at 7:30. They'd established a routine quickly, almost frighteningly so. Lorenzo would play with Matteo for an hour. Dinosaurs, or blocks, or reading books with voices that made their son laugh. Then they'd all have dinner together at Elena's tiny table, Lorenzo looking absurdly out of place among her mismatched chairs, but seeming not to notice or care. After dinner, Lorenzo would help with bath time, getting soaked in the process when Matteo decided to demonstrate how submarines worked. And then he'd sit on the edge of Matteo's bed and listen to Elena read bedtime stories. It was domestic and surreal, and nothing like what Elena had expected. Lorenzo in her apartment felt like a tiger in a birdcage, too large and too dangerous for the space, but he'd made himself fit somehow. He'd learned where she kept the dishes, started bringing groceries without being asked, fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom that Elena had been meaning to call the landlord about for months. You don't have to do that, she'd said, watching him work under the sink with tools that had appeared from somewhere. I know, Lorenzo had replied, his voice slightly muffled, but it was annoying me. It's not your apartment. My son lives here. That makes it my concern. He'd emerged from under the sink, wrench in hand, looking far too attractive with his sleeves rolled up and a smudge of grease on his jaw. Besides, you're moving this weekend, and your landlord is an ass who wouldn't fix it anyway. I'm saving you the aggravation. Elena had wanted to argue, but he'd already moved on to checking the locks on the windows, muttering about security hazards in a way that suggested he was cataloging everything wrong with the building for future reference, probably to justify his insistence that they move to a property with actual security. Friday evening, after Matteo had gone to bed, Lorenzo had asked Elena to sit with him on the couch. The living room felt even smaller with both of them in it, and Elena had been hyper-aware of the warmth of his body next to hers. The scent of his cologne mixed with the baby shampoo from Matteo's bath time. I need to tell you some things, Lorenzo had said, his voice serious, about my world and what being associated with me means for both of you. Elena's stomach had nodded. Okay. Most of what I do is legal now. Bianchi Enterprises owns legitimate businesses, real estate, investments. The illegal parts are smaller than they used to be, and getting smaller every year. I've been working on transitioning for the last decade. Lorenzo had leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. But that doesn't mean I don't have enemies. Some from the old days, some who resent the power I still hold, some who just see opportunity in causing me pain. And Matteo is an opportunity, Elena had said quietly. Yes, the moment anyone figures out I have a son, he becomes a target. Not because of anything he's done, but because of who I am. Lorenzo had turned to look at her, his expression grave. That's why the security isn't optional. That's why I need you both somewhere I can protect you. What about when he's older? Elena had asked. What about when he starts asking questions about what you do? Then I'll answer them honestly. I'm not going to lie to my son about who I am. Lorenzo had reached over, taking her hand in his. The touch had sent electricity up her arm. But I'm also going to make sure he has choices I never had. I inherited this empire, Elena. I was groomed for it from birth. Matteo won't be. He can choose to be part of it, or he can choose to walk away completely. That will be his decision when he's old enough to make it. And if he chooses to walk away, you'll let him? Elena had asked skeptically. I'll celebrate it, Lorenzo had said firmly. My father pressured me into this life. I've made my peace with it, and I'm good at what I do, but that doesn't mean I want it for my son. If he wants to be a teacher or an artist or a fucking dinosaur scientist, I'll support that. All I want is for him to be safe and happy, and to know his father loves him. The raw honesty in his voice had made Elena's throat tight. You really mean that? Every word. Lorenzo's thumb had moved across her knuckles, the gesture probably unconscious. I know you're scared. I know this isn't what you planned. But we're in this together now, Elena. You, me, and Matteo. We're a family, whether it's conventional or not. And I protect my family above everything else. We're not a family, Elena had said, but the words had lacked conviction. We're co-parents. Lorenzo's smile had been knowing. Keep telling yourself that. Saturday morning had arrived with moving trucks and security personnel who'd packed up Elena's apartment with military efficiency. Matteo had thought it was the most exciting thing ever, especially when one of the security guys had let him help carry a box of toys. Elena had felt like she was watching the last 4 years of her life being boxed up and labeled, her independence and hard-won stability disappearing into cardboard containers. The drive to Westchester had taken just over an hour, through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, until they'd reached a gated community where the security checkpoint looked more serious than some government buildings. The guard had waved Lorenzo through with recognition and respect, and Elena had noticed the way he'd scanned their vehicle, the professional assessment of someone trained to spot threats. The house itself, because calling it a house felt inadequate, sat on 3 acres of manicured lawn behind additional gates. It was modern but warm, all glass and stone and wood that somehow managed to look both impressive and livable. Nothing like the cold marble mausoleum Elena had been expecting. The main house is mine, Lorenzo had explained as they'd pulled up. But that, he'd pointed to a smaller structure about 50 yards away, connected by a covered walkway. That's yours and Matteo's. Complete privacy, your own entrance, your own everything. I'm not trying to force us all under one roof immediately. Elena had stared at the guest house that was easily 3 times the size of her Brooklyn apartment. You're giving us an entire house. I'm giving you space, Lorenzo had corrected, and security. The property is monitored 24/7, the walls are reinforced, the windows are bulletproof. Nothing gets in or out without me knowing about it. That's not creepy at all, Elena had muttered, but secretly she'd felt relieved. After a week of Lorenzo's warnings about security threats, the idea of bulletproof windows didn't seem excessive anymore. Matteo had been out of the car before it fully stopped, racing toward the guest house with the fearlessness of someone too young to understand property values. Lorenzo had followed at a more sedate pace with Elena beside him, and when they'd walked through the front door, she'd actually gasped. The interior was beautiful, open and filled with light, decorated in warm neutrals that managed to feel both sophisticated and comfortable. But what had stolen her breath was Matteo's room. Sophia had worked magic in less than a week. The room was bigger than their entire Brooklyn living room, with walls painted in soft blues and grays. His bed, shaped like a spaceship, sat in the center, and the entire far wall had been turned into a mural of dinosaurs in a prehistoric landscape that looked museum quality. His toys, his books, even his dinosaur lamp from home. Everything had been arranged in ways that made the room feel both new and familiar. "Mama, look," Matteo had shouted, bouncing on his new bed. "It's a spaceship, and there's dinosaurs, and words had failed him as he'd taken in the custom shelving built to display his dinosaur collection. The reading nook with cushions that matched his favorite color. The art table already stocked with crayons and paper. "Do you like it?" Lorenzo had asked, crouching down to Matteo's level. "It's the best room ever," Matteo had declared with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. "Can Lucas come see it?" "Once you're settled, absolutely," Lorenzo had said, ruffling his hair. "You can invite friends over any time." Elena had watched them together, father and son, and felt something shift in her chest. Lorenzo was good at this, at being a dad. He was patient and attentive, and genuinely interested in what Matteo had to say. It wasn't an act or an obligation. He wanted to be there, wanted to be part of these moments, and watching him with their son made Elena's carefully maintained walls crack a little more. The rest of the day had been spent unpacking and exploring. Elena's room, connected to Matteo's by a bathroom, was almost embarrassingly luxurious, with a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud, and a walk-in closet bigger than her old bedroom. The guest house had a full kitchen already stocked with groceries, a living room with a fireplace and the most comfortable couches Elena had ever sat on, and a small office space that Lorenzo had said was for her use when she found a new job. "You don't have to rush into working," Lorenzo had said when he'd showed her the office. "Take time to adjust to make sure Matteo's settled." "I need to work," Elena had insisted. "I need something that's mine." Lorenzo had studied her for a long moment. "Okay, but Elena, you don't have to prove your independence to me. I know you're capable. I know you're smart and competent, and you've been raising our son on your own for 4 years. You don't have anything to prove." "I have everything to prove," Elena had said quietly. "I'm living in a house you provided, in a property you own, under security you arranged. The only thing I have left is my ability to take care of myself professionally." "Fair enough." Lorenzo had moved closer, invading her space in a way that made her pulse quicken. "But for what it's worth, I don't see you as a charity case or a dependent. I see you as the mother of my child, and someone He'd paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Someone I respect. Whatever you decide to do work-wise, I'll support it." The almost confession had hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed ready to address. Elena had been hyper-aware of how close he was, of the way his eyes had dropped briefly to her lips before meeting her gaze again, of the tension that had been building all week every time they were alone together. "I should check on Matteo," she'd said, stepping back before she did something stupid like kissing her son's father, who was also a Mafia boss, and definitely off-limits for approximately 1,000,000 reasons. Lorenzo had let her go, but the heat in his eyes had suggested the conversation wasn't over, just postponed. That first night in Westchester, Elena had tucked Matteo into his spaceship bed and listened to him chatter about all the amazing things in his new room. When he'd finally fallen asleep, she'd stood by his window looking out over the grounds, watching security lights illuminate the perimeter and trying to figure out how her life had gotten to this point. A knock on the guest house door had come at 9, and Elena had found Lorenzo standing there with 2 glasses of wine and a tentative expression. "Thought you might need this after the day you've had." She'd accepted the glass and stepped aside to let him in. They'd ended up on the couch in the living room, a careful distance between them, sipping wine and talking about logistics. Matteo's new school started Monday. Lorenzo had already enrolled him in a private pre-K 15 minutes away, complete with background checks on all the staff and additional security that had been arranged discreetly. Elena would need to meet with the teachers, fill out paperwork, figure out carpool situations. "You've thought of everything," Elena had said, slightly overwhelmed. "I've tried." Lorenzo had set his wine glass down, turning to face her. "Elena, I know this is all happening fast. I know you're probably feeling like your life got hijacked. But I want you to know that I'm not trying to control you. I'm trying to protect you both." "I know," Elena had admitted. "It's just, I've been on my own for so long, making my own decisions, handling everything myself. And now suddenly I have to consult with you about everything because it affects Matteo. It's an adjustment. For me too, Lorenzo had said. I've spent my entire adult life alone, focused on business, never planning for anything like this. And now I have a son, and he's perfect and terrifying, and I'm trying really hard not to screw this up. The vulnerability in his admission had surprised her. Lorenzo always seemed so confident, so in control. Seeing the uncertainty underneath had been humanizing. You're doing great with him. Better than great, actually. He adores you. He barely knows me. Kids are good judges of character. They know when someone is genuine. Elena had picked at the couch cushion, not looking at him. That night, 5 years ago, did you mean it when you said you would have called if you'd been able to? Lorenzo had been quiet for so long she'd thought he wasn't going to answer. Yes. I thought about you for weeks after, even after I got out of the hospital. Couldn't get you out of my head. The way you laughed, the things you said about wanting to make the world better. You were so full of hope and optimism, so different from the world I lived in. I wanted to call, but I figured I'd already put you at risk just by spending that night with you. Guys like me, we don't get to keep good things. We just destroy them. You didn't destroy me, Elena had said softly. You gave me Matteo. Best accident I ever made, Lorenzo had said with a slight smile. Then, more seriously, what about you? Did you ever try to find me after you found out you were pregnant? Elena had nodded. I researched you obsessively, found out exactly who you were, what you did, what being associated with you would mean. And I made a choice to protect my baby from all of that. I'm still not sure if it was the right choice. You did what you thought was best with the information you had. I can't fault you for that. Lorenzo had shifted closer, his hand reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. But we have a chance now to do this right, to give Matteo everything he needs and deserves. And maybe we figure out what this is between us too. There's nothing between us, Elena had said. But she hadn't moved away from his touch. Liar, Lorenzo had murmured, his thumb tracing her jawline. There's been something between us since that night 5 years ago, and you know it. Why do you think I never recognized you when you came in for that interview? Because I wasn't looking for you, wasn't expecting to ever see you again. But now I can't stop seeing you. Lorenzo, Elena had breathed. Warning or plea, she wasn't sure. Tell me you don't feel this, he'd challenged, his face inches from hers now. Tell me you don't think about what it would be like if we tried this for real. Elena had wanted to lie, but the words wouldn't come. She did feel it, that pull between them that had nothing to do with co-parenting, and everything to do with the way he looked at her, the way her body responded when he was near, the way 5 years of professional distance had done nothing to diminish the attraction that had sparked between them in a garden under fairy lights. I feel it, she'd admitted, but that doesn't mean acting on it is a good idea. We're trying to figure out how to be parents together. Adding a relationship to that would complicate everything. Everything's already complicated, Lorenzo had pointed out. What's a little more? He'd kissed her then, not asking permission, but not forcing either. Just closing that last distance and capturing her lips with his in a kiss that had been 5 years and 4 years and 1 week in the making. Elena had melted into it, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer as his arms wrapped around her waist. The kiss had been everything, desperate and tender and familiar and new all at once. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Lorenzo had pressed his forehead against hers. Tell me this is real. Tell me I'm not imagining this. It's real, Elena had whispered. God help us both. It's real. Then let's try, Lorenzo had said. Let's see if we can be more than just co-parents. Let's see if we can be a real family. Elena had wanted to say yes immediately, but fear had held her back. What if it doesn't work? What if we try this and it falls apart, and then Matteo is caught in the middle? What if it does work, Lorenzo had countered. What if we're amazing together and Matteo gets to grow up with parents who actually love each other? Isn't that worth the risk? Put like that, it had been hard to argue. Elena had kissed him again, softer this time, less desperate and more certain. We take this slow, for Matteo's sake. As slow as you need, Lorenzo had agreed. I've waited 5 years. I can wait a little longer. But slow had proven difficult when every evening Lorenzo came over for dinner and stayed through Mateo's bedtime routine. When he'd found excuses to touch her, to stand close, to look at her in ways that made her breath catch. When they'd started ending their evenings on the couch with wine and conversation that stretched late into the night, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other in ways they'd never had the chance to before. The second week in the Westchester house, Mateo had started at his new school and surprised everyone by adapting almost immediately. He'd made friends with 2 other boys in his class, declared his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the best teacher in the world, and came home every day with artwork and stories and the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he was thriving rather than traumatized by all the changes. "He's resilient," Lorenzo had said one evening, while they watched Mateo play in the backyard with the elaborate playground Lorenzo had installed in record time. "Must get that from you." "He gets his stubbornness from you," Elena had teased, leaning against the deck railing. Yesterday he spent 20 minutes arguing with Mrs. Patterson about whether pterodactyls were technically dinosaurs. "What's the verdict?" Lorenzo had asked with amusement. "They're not, apparently." He was very disappointed to learn this. Elena had smiled, watching their son attempt to climb to the top of the slide, wearing his dinosaur backpack for reasons only 4-year-olds understood. "He's happy here. I wasn't sure he would be, but he really is." "And you?" Lorenzo had moved behind her, his hands coming to rest on her hips, pulling her back against his chest. "Are you happy here?" Elena had leaned into him, allowing herself the luxury of his warmth and strength. "I'm getting there. It's strange, feeling safe. I've been in survival mode for so long, just trying to keep us afloat and protected, that actually being secure feels almost wrong somehow." "You can let your guard down," Lorenzo had murmured against her ear. "You don't have to do everything alone anymore." "I'm not used to having help," Elena had admitted, "or having someone care about what happens to me beyond what it means for Mateo." Lorenzo had turned her in his arms so she was facing him. "I care about what happens to you, Elena, not just because you're Mateo's mother, although that would be reason enough, but because you're brilliant and strong, and you've done an amazing job, raising our son against impossible odds. Because when you smile, really smile, it makes something in my chest feel lighter, because I'm falling for you, have been since the moment you walked into my office 5 years ago, even if I didn't realize it then." The confession had stolen her breath. "Lorenzo." "You don't have to say it back," he'd said quickly. "I know this is all moving fast and you need time. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that this isn't just about Mateo for me. You matter, Elena. You matter a lot." Elena had pulled him down into a kiss that she'd hoped conveyed everything she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. That she was falling too, despite every rational reason not to. That he made her feel things she'd thought were dead after that night 5 years ago when she'd woken up alone. That the idea of being a real family with him terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. They'd been so absorbed in each other that neither had noticed Mateo abandon his playground and come up onto the deck until his voice had piped up. "Are you guys dating now?" Elena had jumped back from Lorenzo like she'd been burned, her face flaming. "Mateo, we're figuring things out," Lorenzo had interrupted smoothly, dropping to Mateo's level. "How do you feel about that? About me and your mama maybe being together?" Mateo had considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "Like, together, like Lucas's parents." "Something like that," Lorenzo had confirmed. "Would that be okay with you?" "Will you leave like Lucas's dad did?" Mateo had asked, and the question had hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd had no idea her son had been affected by his friend's parents' divorce. "Never," Lorenzo had said with absolute conviction. "I'm not going anywhere, Mateo. Not from you and not from your mama. I promise you that." "Okay then," Mateo had said, with the casual acceptance of a child who'd been given the reassurance he needed. "Can I have a snack now?" The moment had passed that easily for him, but Elena had felt the weight of Lorenzo's promise settle over her. He'd meant it. She could see it in his eyes, feel it in the way he'd looked at their son. This wasn't a casual thing for him. This was commitment, forever, the kind of certainty she'd been too scared to even hope for. Over the following weeks, they'd settled into a rhythm that had started to feel dangerously like a real family. Lorenzo worked from home most days, his office in the main house close enough that he could pop over for lunch or steal kisses in the kitchen when Matteo wasn't looking. Dinners were always together, the three of them around the table in the guest house, and Lorenzo had started sleeping on the couch some nights, claiming it was too late to walk back to the main house, but really just wanting to be close to them. Elena had found a remote position doing executive consulting for a tech startup, work that challenged her and paid well and let her make her own hours. She'd insisted on paying Lorenzo rent for the guest house, a token amount he'd rolled his eyes at, but accepted because he understood she needed the independence. They'd argued about money exactly once, when Lorenzo had tried to open a trust fund for Matteo worth more than Elena would make in 10 lifetimes. "He's 4, she'd protested. "He doesn't need millions of dollars." "He's my heir," Lorenzo had countered. "He gets everything whether we put it in a trust now or wait until I'm dead. This way it's protected, managed properly, there for him when he needs it." "It's too much," Elena had insisted. "It's his birthright." Lorenzo had pulled her close. "Stubborn meets stubborn. I know you want him to grow up normal, to understand the value of money and hard work. Fine, we'll teach him that. But I'm not going to pretend I don't have resources that can make his life easier. He's a Bianchi, Elena. That comes with certain things, whether you like it or not." They'd compromised, as they'd learned to do. The trust would exist, but Matteo wouldn't know about it until he was much older. They'd raise him to be grounded, to work for what he wanted, to understand that money was a tool, not an identity. But Lorenzo's world and Lorenzo's wealth would always be part of the equation, for better or worse. The first real test of their new dynamic had come 6 weeks after they'd moved to Westchester. Lorenzo had received a credible threat against his organization, which apparently translated to a threat against anyone associated with him. Security had been increased to the point where Elena couldn't go to the grocery store without an escort, and Matteo's school had gotten additional personnel that tried and mostly failed to be inconspicuous. "This is what I was afraid of," Elena had said one evening after Matteo was in bed, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "This is exactly why I didn't want him in your world." "He's safe," Lorenzo had said from the couch, watching her wear a path in the rug. "No one is getting near him." "But they want to," Elena had shot back. "That's the problem. Lorenzo, your enemies want to hurt him to hurt you. He's 4 years old and he's a target because of decisions we made." "Decisions I made," Lorenzo had corrected. "This is my world, my consequences. You were just trying to raise our son in peace. And now I can't even take him to the park without armed guards," Elena had said, her voice breaking. "This isn't the life I wanted for him." Lorenzo had stood and crossed to her, taking her shoulders in his hands and forcing her to stop pacing. "Do you regret moving here? Regret letting me into his life?" Elena had wanted to say yes, wanted to use this as an excuse to rebuild her walls, but she couldn't lie. "No, I don't regret it. But I'm terrified, Lorenzo. Every single day I'm terrified that something will happen to him because of who you are." "Join the club," Lorenzo had said quietly. "I've been terrified since the moment I realized he existed. Terrified I'd lose him before I got to know him. Terrified I'd mess this up. Terrified every single second that someone will use him to hurt me. That fear doesn't go away, Elena. I just have to live with it and do everything in my power to keep him safe." "What if everything in your power isn't enough?" Elena had whispered. "Then I'll burn down the entire city until it is," Lorenzo had said simply, and the cold certainty in his voice had reminded her exactly who she was dealing with. "No one touches our son. No one even gets close. And anyone who tries will learn very quickly why you don't threaten a Bianchi's family." The threat had been neutralized within 48 hours in ways Elena had known better than to ask about. The security had remained tight, but the immediate danger had passed, and life had slowly returned to their new version of normal. But the incident had driven home the reality of their situation in ways that couldn't be ignored. Matteo's life would always have this element of danger, this shadow of his father's world hovering over ordinary moments. Elena had made peace with it because she had to, because the alternative was walking away, and she couldn't do that anymore. Not when she'd seen how much Matteo needed Lorenzo, how he bloomed under his father's attention and pride. Not when she'd fallen so completely for the man behind the reputation that the idea of leaving made her chest ache. They'd been in Westchester for 3 months, when Lorenzo had come to the guest house late one night carrying a small box. Elena had been working in the office, reviewing contracts for her consulting job, and she'd looked up to find him in the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's late," she'd said, checking the time, nearly midnight. "Everything okay?" "Come sit with me," Lorenzo had said, holding out his hand. They'd ended up on the couch as they did most nights, but this time Lorenzo had seemed nervous in a way she'd never seen from him. The man who controlled a criminal empire with ruthless confidence was fidgeting with the small box in his hands like a teenager working up courage. "I need to tell you something," Lorenzo had started. "About that night 5 years ago. About why I really never called." Elena had tensed, not sure she wanted to hear this. "Lorenzo, it's fine. It was a long time ago." "It matters," Lorenzo had insisted. "Because I need you to understand that leaving you wasn't a choice. I was in a coma for 3 weeks after the attempt on my life. When I woke up, I spent 2 weeks in recovery, unable to use my hands properly. Couldn't dial a phone or write or do much of anything. By the time I was functional enough to try to find you, I'd convinced myself that 6 weeks was too long, that you'd moved on, that showing up in your life would only bring you danger." "You could have tried," Elena had said, old hurt surfacing despite her best efforts. "I know. And I didn't because I was a coward who told himself he was being noble." Lorenzo had opened the box, revealing a delicate necklace with a pendant that caught the light. "I bought this the day after we met. Was planning to give it to you when I called, as an excuse to see you again. I've carried it with me for 5 years, a reminder of the biggest mistake I ever made." Elena had stared at the necklace, throat tight. "Lorenzo, I'm not trying to rewrite history or make excuses. I just need you to know that not calling you haunted me. And then when you walked into my office 5 years later, I felt like I'd been given a second chance, even though I didn't recognize why at the time." Lorenzo had taken the necklace from the box, the pendant spinning slowly. "You don't have to accept this. I just wanted you to know that you mattered then, and you matter even more now." Elena had turned so he could fasten the necklace, feeling the cool metal settle against her skin. "What am I supposed to do with that information?" "Whatever you want," Lorenzo had said, his hands settling on her shoulders. "But Elena, I need you to know something else. I'm in love with you. Not because you're Matteo's mother, not because of that night 5 years ago, but because of who you are now. The way you fight for what you believe in, the way you love our son, the way you call me out when I'm being an ass, the way you make me want to be better than I am. I'm completely, irrevocably in love with you." The declaration had stolen her breath, left her speechless. Lorenzo had continued, words tumbling out like he needed to get them all said before she could stop him. "I know I don't deserve you. I know my world is dangerous and messy and not what you wanted for yourself or Matteo. But I'm asking you to choose me anyway. Choose us. Let me love you the way you deserve. Let me build a real family with you, not just for our son, but for us too." Elena had turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "You're an idiot." Lorenzo had blinked, clearly not the response he'd expected. "What?" "You're an idiot if you think you need to convince me," Elena had said, laughing through her tears. "I've been in love with you for weeks, maybe longer. I was just too scared to say it because everything happened so fast, and I didn't want to mess things up. But Lorenzo, I love you. I love watching you with Matteo. I love the way you remember how I take my coffee. I love that you fixed my leaky faucet and installed a playground and bought out an entire toy store to make our son happy. I love that you're terrifying and tender, ruthless and gentle, dangerous and the safest person I know all at the same time." "Elena," Lorenzo had breathed her name like a prayer. "I'm choosing you," Elena had said firmly. "I'm choosing us. Whatever that looks like, whatever challenges come, I'm all in." Lorenzo had kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. And when they'd finally broken apart, they'd both been breathless and grinning like idiots. "Move into the main house," Lorenzo had said. "You and Matteo both. We'll convert part of it into private space for you two, if you need that separation. But I want to wake up with you every morning. I want to fall asleep next to you every night. I want us all under one roof like a real family." "Okay," Elena had said, the word simple but weighted with everything it meant. "Yes, we'll move in." They'd told Matteo the next morning over breakfast, and their son had responded with the straightforward enthusiasm that made being four both exhausting and delightful. "Does this mean Lorenzo gets to read me bedtime stories every night?" he'd asked, syrup from his pancakes coating his chin. Every single night, Lorenzo had confirmed, wiping his son's face with a gentleness that still surprised Elena every time she witnessed it. "And we can have breakfast together every morning, just like this. And you and Mama are boyfriend and girlfriend," Matteo had pressed, because apparently nothing got past a 4-year-old. "Something like that," Elena had said, meeting Lorenzo's eyes across the table. "Is that okay with you?" Matteo had considered this with exaggerated seriousness, tilting his head in that way that was pure Lorenzo. "Will there be kissing? Lucas says his parents kiss all the time, and it's gross." "Probably some kissing," Lorenzo had admitted, fighting a smile. "But we'll try to keep the gross stuff to a minimum." "Okay then," Matteo had declared, returning his attention to his pancakes. "Can I have more syrup?" And just like that, their family had been official. They'd moved into the main house that weekend, Elena choosing rooms that could be converted into a private suite for her and Matteo, keeping some boundaries even as they merged their lives completely. Lorenzo had been patient with the logistics, understanding that she needed space that was hers, that letting him in completely required time and trust that was still being built. The first night in the main house, after Matteo had been tucked into his new room, one that connected to Elena's through a bathroom just like in the guest house, but somehow felt more permanent here, Lorenzo had pulled Elena into his bedroom. Their bedroom, he'd corrected, when she'd hesitated at the threshold. She'd spent the night wrapped in his arms, talking about everything and nothing until words had given way to touches, and touches had given way to something deeper, a reconnection that felt both new and like coming home. "I can't believe this is real," Elena had whispered in the dark afterward, her head on Lorenzo's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "6 months ago, I was serving you coffee and hiding my son's existence. Now I'm in your bed planning our future together." "Best 6 months of my life," Lorenzo had murmured against her hair. Even with the terror and the arguments and the security threats. "Best 6 months, hands down." "We're crazy," Elena had said, but she'd been smiling. "This is completely insane." "Probably," Lorenzo had agreed. "But I wouldn't change any of it. Every moment, every mistake, every choice that led us here, I wouldn't change a single thing." In the weeks that followed, they'd built a life that felt both extraordinary and surprisingly normal. Lorenzo still ran his empire, but more of his business had transitioned to legitimate operations than Elena had realized. And he'd been serious about keeping the dangerous elements separate from their family life. He worked from home most days, slipping into his office in the main house for meetings, while Elena worked in her own space and Matteo attended school. Evenings were sacred, dedicated to family dinners and homework help once Matteo started kindergarten, to playing in the backyard that had been transformed into a child's paradise, to movie nights where they piled on the couch with popcorn and Disney films. Lorenzo had proven to be surprisingly good at normal, at being present and engaged, at making Matteo the center of his world in ways that had nothing to do with protection or legacy and everything to do with simply loving his son. They'd had their challenges, moments when Lorenzo's world had intruded in ways that reminded Elena this wasn't a fairy tale. Security threats that required lockdowns, business dealings that kept Lorenzo out late and came home with tension in his shoulders and shadows in his eyes, moments when she'd glimpsed the ruthless man underneath the devoted father and had to reconcile both versions of him in her mind. But they'd also had triumph. Matteo's first day of kindergarten, when he'd walked in fearlessly holding both their hands, Lorenzo's eyes suspiciously wet as they'd watched him go. The night Elena's consulting business had landed its biggest client yet, and Lorenzo had celebrated like it was his own victory, opening champagne and toasting her success with genuine pride. The afternoon Matteo had drawn a picture of their family, 3 figures holding hands with a house and a dog he'd been lobbying for in the background, and had labeled it "My Family" in crooked letters that had made them both cry. 6 months after they'd moved into the main house, Lorenzo had proposed, not with fanfare or grand gestures, but quietly one evening after Matteo was asleep. pulling Elena into the home office where they'd both been working and getting down on one knee with a ring that had taken her breath away. "I know we're already a family," Lorenzo had said, holding the ring with hands that only shook slightly. "I know we're already committed and living together and raising our son, but I want to make it official, Elena. I want you to be my wife. Want to stand up in front of everyone and claim you as mine. Will you marry me?" Elena had pulled him to his feet and kissed him before saying yes, before even looking at the ring, because the answer had never been in question. Yes. Absolutely, yes. They'd married 3 months later in a small ceremony on the property, just family and close friends. Matteo serving as ring bearer with the seriousness of someone handling nuclear codes. Lorenzo's associates had been there, men with dangerous reputations and expensive suits, who'd toasted their boss's happiness with genuine warmth. Maria Chen had cried through the entire ceremony, proud of the family Elena had built against impossible odds. Standing at the altar, watching Lorenzo's face as she'd walked toward him, Elena had thought about that night 5 years ago in a garden under fairy lights. How she'd believed it was just a moment, a brief brush with magic that would fade with morning. She'd never imagined that the charming man who'd listened to her dreams would become the father of her child, would love their son with fierce devotion, would love her with an intensity that still took her breath away. She'd never imagined that the dangerous Mafia boss whose office she'd walked into desperate for a job would become her partner, her husband, the person she trusted more than anyone else in the world, that his world, for all its darkness, would also contain this much light. "I love you," Lorenzo had whispered as they'd been pronounced husband and wife, before he'd kissed her in front of everyone, pouring 5 years of missed chances and second opportunities and hard-won happiness into the gesture. "I love you too," Elena had whispered back, and meant it with everything in her. That night, after the reception had ended and Matteo had fallen asleep in his room, exhausted from dancing and cake, Lorenzo had pulled Elena onto the balcony off their bedroom. The property stretched out before them, lights twinkling across the grounds, security moving in shadows that no longer frightened her, because she knew they were there to protect rather than threaten. "What are you thinking?" Lorenzo had asked, pulling her back against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist. "That we have a good life," Elena had said, leaning into his warmth. "A strange one, definitely unconventional, but good." "The best," Lorenzo had agreed. "You, me, Matteo, everything I never knew I wanted and definitely didn't deserve." "You deserve this," Elena had said firmly, turning in his arms to face him. "You deserve happiness and love and a family. Stop acting like you don't." Lorenzo had kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips, soft and sweet and full of promise. "As long as I have you two, I have everything." They'd stood there in the darkness, holding each other and watching the stars, both thinking about the journey that had brought them here, the mistakes and the secrets, the fear and the courage, the moment 5 years ago that had created Matteo, and the moment 6 months ago when everything had changed. All of it had led to this, to a family that shouldn't have worked on paper, but somehow did in reality. Inside the house, Matteo stirred in his sleep, probably dreaming about dinosaurs or spaceships or whatever occupied the mind of a 5-year-old. Their son who looked like his father and had his mother's heart, who was growing up surrounded by love and security, even if that security came with armed guards and bulletproof windows, who would have choices his father never had, opportunities to build whatever life he wanted, supported by parents who would move heaven and earth to protect him. This was their family now, imperfect and complicated and built from second chances and fierce determination. But it was theirs, and it was real, and it was everything. Elena looked up at her husband, the man who'd been a stranger, then a secret, then a boss, then a father, and finally her partner in every way that mattered. "No regrets?" she asked quietly. "Not a single one," Lorenzo said without hesitation. "You?" Elena smiled, thinking about the terrified girl who'd hidden her pregnancy, the desperate woman who'd taken a job with a Mafia boss, the mother who'd kept the biggest secret of all for 4 years. She thought about the photo that had changed everything, the moment her carefully constructed walls had crumbled, the choice she'd made to trust Lorenzo with their son and eventually with her heart. None, Elena said, and meant it completely. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Above them, stars wheeled across the sky, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. Inside the house, their son slept peacefully, guarded by his father's resources and his mother's love. And on the balcony, two people who'd found their way back to each other against all odds held each other close and looked toward a future that finally felt secure. Their story had started with secrets and fear, with a one-night stand that became a hidden pregnancy, with 5 years of deception born from desperation. But it had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. A love story built on truth and trust, on learning that family wasn't just about blood or proximity, but about choosing each other every single day. Lorenzo tightened his arms around Elena, and she rested her head against his shoulder, both of them content to stand in the quiet and simply be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the complicated reality of merging two worlds that had never been meant to collide. But tonight they had this, peace and love, and the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. Because Elena wasn't just Lorenzo's assistant anymore, wasn't just the mother of his child. She was his wife, his partner, his equal in all the ways that mattered. And Lorenzo wasn't just a mafia boss, wasn't just the father who'd missed the first 4 years of his son's life. He was a husband who cherished his wife, a father devoted to his child, a man who'd learned that the greatest power wasn't control over an empire, but love for the family he'd found when he'd stopped looking. This was their happy ending and their new beginning, wrapped together in the same moment, imperfect and real and absolutely theirs. And in the morning, they would wake up together as a family, ready to face whatever the day brought, secure in the knowledge that they'd found their way home to each other at last.